You watch her laugh at something on her phone, and for just a moment, her guard drops completely. Her shoulders relax, her breathing changes, and something almost vulnerable flickers across her face before she catches herself and reconstructs that careful composure she wears like armor. In that split second, you've glimpsed something Machiavelli understood 5 centuries ago but never fully articulated in his political treatises. There are hidden psychological mechanisms operating beneath the surface of every interaction, invisible forces that shape behavior in ways most people never recognize, let alone understand. Machiavelli wrote extensively about power, manipulation, and human nature, but his most profound insights about the psychology of influence were buried between the lines of his political philosophy. He observed patterns in human behavior that modern psychology has only recently begun to validate through neuroscience and attachment theory research. What he saw in the courts of Renaissance Italy reveals universal truths about how emotional security, validation, and psychological safety operate as powerful motivators in all human relationships. Here's what most people misunderstand about Machiavelli's insights. They think his observations were about tactics and strategy, but they were actually about understanding the fundamental human need for emotional security and how that need creates predictable patterns in behavior. When you understand these psychological mechanisms, you're not learning how to manipulate anyone. You're developing the emotional intelligence to recognize what drives human behavior at its deepest levels. The first mechanism Machiavelli identified revolves around what modern psychology calls the attachment system. He noticed that people, regardless of their apparent strength or independence, have an innate need to feel psychologically safe with others. This need for emotional security creates specific behavioral patterns that repeat across relationships, generations, and even cultures. When someone feels truly seen and understood without judgment, their defensive mechanisms naturally begin to relax. It's not manipulation when you recognize this pattern, it's emotional intelligence. Subscribe if you want to understand the hidden mechanisms behind human behavior, because what we're exploring here goes far deeper than surface-level social dynamics. Machiavelli observed that the people who appeared most self-sufficient were often those whose need for emotional validation ran deepest. In his correspondence with friends, he wrote about how the most powerful women in Renaissance courts would reveal their deepest vulnerabilities to those who approached them without agenda, without trying to impress or convince them of anything. This wasn't about gender. It was about a fundamental human psychological truth. When someone stops trying to prove their worth to you and instead demonstrates genuine curiosity about who they are beneath their social mask, something profound shifts in the dynamic. Modern attachment research validates exactly what Machiavelli observed. Dr. Sue Johnson's work on emotionally focused therapy shows that all humans, regardless of how independent they appear, have what she calls attachment injuries, from times when they felt emotionally abandoned or misunderstood. These experiences create defensive patterns designed to protect against future emotional pain. But here's the fascinating part. When someone encounters genuine emotional safety, these defensive patterns don't just relax. They often reverse completely. The second mechanism Machiavelli identifies centers around what he called the paradox of vulnerability. He noticed that people who tried hardest to appear strong and controlled often had the deepest need to feel understood and accepted for their authentic selves, not the persona they presented to the world. This creates what modern psychology recognizes as emotional exhaustion. Constantly maintaining a protective facade requires enormous psychological energy. When someone offers a space where that facade isn't necessary, the relief can be overwhelming. Think about the last time someone really listened to you without trying to fix you, judge you, or offer advice. Remember how your body felt when you realized you could speak honestly without having to manage their reaction or protect their feelings. That's the psychological mechanism Machiavelli was describing. It's not about weakness. It's about the fundamental human need for authentic connection. But here's where Machiavelli's insights become particularly profound. He observed that this need for authentic connection becomes stronger, not weaker, as someone becomes more successful or powerful in their external life. The higher someone rises in their career, social status, or public persona, the fewer people they encounter who see them as anything other than what they can provide or represent. This creates what researchers now call successful person isolation. The more accomplished someone becomes, the more they crave interactions where they can simply be human. Dr. Brené Brown's research on vulnerability supports exactly what Machiavelli observed centuries ago. People who appear most self-sufficient often have the deepest need to feel emotionally safe enough to lower their guard. But they can only do this when they trust that their authentic self won't be used against them, judged, or exploited in some way. The third psychological mechanism Machiavelli identified involves what modern neuroscience calls mirror neurons. He noticed that people unconsciously mirror the emotional state and energy of those around them. But this mirroring happens most powerfully when someone feels emotionally safe. When you approach interactions with genuine calm and centeredness, not the performed confidence that most people try to project, others begin to mirror that authentic groundedness. It's not a technique you apply, it's a natural result of being genuinely comfortable with yourself. Machiavelli wrote privately about how the most magnetic people he knew weren't those who tried to be charming or impressive. They were those who had developed what he called sovereign presence. They didn't need anything from the interaction. They weren't trying to prove anything or get anywhere. This absence of hidden agenda created a psychological space where others could relax their normal social defenses. Share in the comments if you've experienced this dynamic before, because recognizing these patterns is the first step toward understanding the deeper psychology of human connection. Here's what makes this particularly fascinating from a psychological perspective. When someone feels genuinely safe in your presence, when they sense that you're not trying to get anything from them or change them in any way, their nervous system begins to shift from a defensive state to what Dr. Stephen Porges calls the social engagement system. This isn't conscious. It happens at a neurological level. Their breathing deepens, their facial expressions soften, and they become naturally more open and authentic. Machiavelli observed this pattern repeatedly, but understood something that most people miss entirely. This shift only happens when your own emotional state is genuinely grounded and secure. If you're trying to create safety for someone else while you're internally anxious, needy, or agenda-driven, they'll sense that incongruence immediately. The nervous system reads authenticity at levels far below conscious awareness. You cannot fake genuine emotional security. The fourth mechanism involves what Machiavelli called the psychology of recognition. He noticed that everyone, regardless of how confident they appear, has parts of themselves they believe are unlovable or unacceptable. These hidden aspects of their personality create what modern psychology calls shadow material. When someone encounters a person who can see these hidden parts without judgment or the need to fix them, the relief is profound. This isn't about accepting bad behavior or unhealthy patterns. It's about recognizing the difference between someone's coping mechanisms and their authentic self. Machiavelli understood that beneath every defensive behavior is usually an unmet need for safety, understanding, or acceptance. When you can see past the surface behavior to the underlying need, you're demonstrating a level of emotional intelligence that most people rarely encounter. Dr. Carl Jung's work on shadow integration explains exactly what Machiavelli observed. The parts of ourselves we try to hide don't disappear. They require enormous energy to suppress, and they create internal conflict that manifests as anxiety, perfectionism, or other forms of psychological tension. When someone feels safe enough to acknowledge these hidden aspects of themselves, the energy that was bound up in suppression becomes available for genuine connection and creativity. But here's the crucial understanding that separates emotional intelligence from manipulation. These mechanisms work both ways. As you develop the capacity to create genuine emotional safety for others, you also become more authentic and psychologically integrated yourself. Real emotional intelligence isn't a tool you use on others. It's a way of being that transforms every relationship in your life, starting with your relationship with yourself. Machiavelli's fifth observation involves what he called the paradox of power. He noticed that people who wielded significant external power often felt most powerless in their personal relationships. This happens because external power is based on role, status, or achievement, while personal power comes from emotional authenticity and self-acceptance. Someone can be incredibly successful professionally while feeling completely lost in intimate relationships. This creates what modern psychology recognizes as compartmentalization. Someone might be confident and decisive in boardroom meetings, but anxious and uncertain when it comes to expressing their emotional needs or desires. They've learned to perform competence in external settings, but they've never developed the skills for emotional intimacy and authentic self-expression. When someone who understands these psychological mechanisms encounters this dynamic, they don't try to impress with their own achievements or status. Instead, they create space for the person's more vulnerable, authentic self to emerge. This might mean asking questions that go beyond surface-level conversation. It might mean sharing something genuine about their own experience. It's about connecting with the human being beneath the professional persona. The sixth mechanism Machiavelli identified centers around what he called emotional contagion. He observed that emotions spread between people through invisible channels, but this transmission happens most powerfully between people who feel connected and safe with each other. When you've developed genuine emotional stability and self-possession, others begin to experience those qualities in your presence. Modern neuroscience has validated this observation through research on emotional regulation and interpersonal neurobiology. Dr. Dan Siegel's work shows that nervous systems actually synchronize when people feel emotionally safe together. If your nervous system is regulated and calm, others begin to mirror that state unconsciously. But if you're internally anxious or needy while trying to appear calm, they'll pick up on the incongruence and mirror your actual emotional state, not your performed one. This is why authentic personal development is so crucial for anyone who wants to understand these psychological mechanisms. You cannot give what you don't have. If you want to create emotional safety for others, you must first develop genuine emotional security within yourself. This means doing the inner work to heal your own attachment injuries, develop self-compassion, and learn to regulate your own emotional states without depending on others for validation. Like this video if this revelation changes how you see relationships, because understanding these mechanisms transforms everything about how you connect with others. Here's what Machiavelli understood that most people miss entirely. These psychological mechanisms aren't techniques you apply strategically. They're natural results of becoming emotionally mature and psychologically integrated. When you've done the work to heal your own emotional wounds and develop genuine self-acceptance, you naturally begin to see others with more compassion and clarity. You're no longer projecting your own unmet needs onto them or trying to get them to fill roles in your psychological drama. This emotional maturity creates what researchers call earned secure attachment. Even if you didn't experience consistent emotional safety in your early relationships, you can develop the capacity to create that safety for yourself and others through conscious psychological work. This isn't about perfection. It's about developing the awareness and skills to recognize emotional patterns and respond with wisdom rather than reactivity. The seventh and perhaps most profound mechanism Machiavelli observed involves what he called the psychology of authentic presence. He noticed that the most magnetic people weren't those who tried hardest to be interesting or attractive. They were those who had become genuinely comfortable with their own solitude and internal landscape. This self-possession created a natural confidence that didn't depend on external validation or approval. When someone has developed this quality of authentic presence, they don't need anything from interactions with others. They're not trying to prove their worth, get validation, or achieve any particular outcome. This absence of hidden agenda creates psychological space for genuine connection to emerge organically. Others sense this freedom from neediness and begin to relax their own defensive mechanisms. But developing authentic presence requires confronting everything within yourself that you've been trying to avoid or fix. It means making peace with your imperfections, accepting your emotional needs without shame, and learning to provide internal validation for yourself rather than seeking it from others. This is profound psychological work that most people avoid because it requires facing uncomfortable truths about themselves. Machiavelli understood that this journey toward authentic self-possession is what separates truly magnetic people from those who are simply good at social performance. External charisma might work temporarily, but authentic presence creates lasting impact because it's based on genuine psychological integration rather than learned techniques. The final mechanism involves what Machiavelli called the paradox of non-attachment. He observed that people who were most successful in relationships were those who genuinely cared about others while remaining emotionally independent from the outcomes of their interactions. They could offer love, support, and genuine interest without becoming attached to how others responded or whether their feelings were reciprocated. This doesn't mean being cold or indifferent. It means developing the emotional maturity to love freely without making your well-being dependent on how others receive that love. When someone senses this quality of non-attached care, they feel both cherished and free. They don't have to manage your emotions or take responsibility for your happiness, which creates space for their authentic feelings to emerge. Modern psychology recognizes this as differentiation. It's the ability to maintain your emotional stability and sense of self while remaining genuinely connected to others. People with high differentiation can be intimate without losing themselves and can handle rejection or disappointment without becoming defensive or withdrawn. Understanding these psychological mechanisms isn't about gaining advantage over others. It's about developing the emotional intelligence to create authentic connections based on mutual respect and genuine care. When you operate from this place of psychological maturity, relationships become opportunities for mutual growth and authentic intimacy rather than strategic games to be won or lost. Machiavelli's deepest insight wasn't about manipulation or control. It was about understanding the profound human need for emotional safety and authentic connection. When you can provide that safety while maintaining your own psychological integrity, you become someone who naturally attracts healthy, meaningful relationships. But this attraction isn't strategic. It's the natural result of becoming the kind of person you yourself would want to be around. The psychology of influence, when understood correctly, is really the psychology of emotional maturity and authentic self-development. As you heal your own attachment wounds and develop genuine self-acceptance, you naturally begin to see others with more compassion and clarity. You stop trying to get your needs met through manipulation or performance and start creating the emotional safety that allows authentic connection to flourish. This is the true wisdom hidden in Machiavelli's observations about human nature. The greatest influence you can have is to become someone who genuinely doesn't need to influence anyone. Someone whose own emotional wholeness creates space for others to discover their authentic selves. In that space of mutual authenticity, real intimacy and lasting connection become possible.